All right, this is Marty Wilson speaking. I'm sitting with Jack Muehlhan at the Monroe County Historical Association. Tanya's with us, and it's July 24th at about 1:30 in the afternoon, and we're here to talk about Jack Muehlhan's life. So Jack, let's start with the question, where and when you were born and who your parents were.
I was born in East Stroudsburg in what's was known as the Monroe County General Hospital. My parents are both European immigrants, my mother from Hungary, my father from Germany. They both came to the country in 1928. They met in Stroudsburg in 1936 and married, and I was born in 1948 in East Stroudsburg in the Monroe County General Hospital.
What brought your parents to the U.S., number one, but to Stroudsburg?
Well, it's an interesting story they told. My father was a shoemaker in Germany, learned the shoemaker trade, and lived through the inflation in Germany after the First World War. Many German people wanted to get out of there because of the runaway inflation. His last memory was a loaf of bread was 1,000,000 German marks. Their plan was to come to this country, work for 5 years, and hopefully by then things would settle down and get back to normal and go back to Germany. But there was a real migration of Germans and other Europeans coming to the United States in the 20s.
When you say they, did he come with other people?
Well, yeah, I will share that. My early memories of Stroudsburg, there was a large German population, and I'll touch on some of the interesting aspects of that. They came to the United States, to New York, but most of them wanted to get out in the country. So there were machine shop owners, boarding house owners, shoemakers, butchers, stonemasons, a large population in the Stroudsburg, Monroe County area.
These people they didn't plan this in Germany. Did they know each other in Germany, these people you're talking about?
No, it's interesting. My father always tells the story that he was in New York and didn't like the big city. He had a distant relative in Pittsburgh, and he was looking to get out of the city. He saw a small ad in a New York paper, a shoemaker shop for sale in Stroudsburg, and he just assumed Pennsylvania was Pittsburgh. So he got on a train, I guess at Grand Central Station, and got off in East Stroudsburg. And he tells the story, he got off the train, he saw East Stroudsburg and he didn't think he liked it, and he wanted to find out when the train went back to New York, and they said, well, it doesn't go back to return till 4 or 5 o'clock. So he thought, well, he'll make the best of it, and he talked to somebody, and he said he had this address of a shoemaker shop that was for sale, and the taxi driver looked at it and said, well, that's in Stroudsburg. So I think he wanted 25 or 30 cents for a taxi ride, but my father, being German and frugal, thought, well, if it's not that far, I could walk it. So he walked it and found a shoemaker shop, and they actually made a deal that day with the shoemaker. It was a man named Scheidemann, who was a longtime shoemaker in Stroudsburg and wanted to retire. So he made the deal with him to buy the shoemaker business for $600. And I think he had $50 or $75 with him. He gave him a $25 deposit, and Mr. Scheidemann told him he could get a room at the American House in Stroudsburg, which was at the corner of 8th and Main, and he got a room there. I think, if my memory is right, it was $22 or $23 a week with 3 meals included. He then went back to Penny's, which was on the corner of 6th and Main, and bought work clothes. And I think he called his aunt in New York and said he wouldn't be coming back because he bought a shoemaker shop, but he would come back over the weekend to get the rest of the money out of the bank to pay for the rest of the shoemaker shop. He told a story that his room and board at the American House included 3 meals a day. And after about the first week, Mrs. Weiss, who the Weiss family owned the American House, came to him and said, I see you're not having lunch. Is there something wrong? And he said, well, no, I'm busy at the shop, so I eat a big breakfast, and then I come back and eat a big dinner. And she said, well, we'll adjust your bill. And it went from $23 a week, I think, back down to $21 because he wasn't having lunch. So that's how he got to Stroudsburg. My mother came to Stroudsburg for a vacation, and there was a boarding house off Hickory Valley Road, which was run by a man named Martin Meyer and his family. And it was typical. They had a farm, but they took in boarders in the summer. So she came for a week's vacation, and Martin Meyer, being German, it was a rallying point for Germans. On Sundays, they would go out there and drink beer, and that's how he met my mother. And he convinced her to stay another week, and she was a nursemaid in Southampton, Long Island, and she agreed to stay another week if he would come to Southampton and visit her. So she stayed the second week. The following Sunday, he drove to Southampton, and he said it took him forever to get there. I think he left at 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning. It took 6 or 7 hours to get there. And they talked about it, and he said, this is not going to work, a long-distance romance. Why don't you just pack your things, come back to Stroudsburg, I'll get you a room, and we'll see how the relationship goes, and we'll get married. So she came back with him. He was at the American House. He got her a room at the Charlie Kuiper residence. And I think 4 or 5 weeks later, they got married. So that's how they got to Stroudsburg. When I was born at the Monroe County General Hospital, it was typical in those days for a woman to be there for 10 days. My mother was in the hospital for 10 days after I was born. Now it's a day or two and you're out the door.
Same day
So,
sometimes, yeah.
So that's the history of how.
Did they speak English before they came to the States?
Sorry?
Did they speak English before they came to the States? Or?
They did not. They learned the language, and that was interesting. They went to night school. Both of them got jobs immediately, went to night school, and 5 years later became citizens, and that was a very important thing to them. My father instilled in us that you as a citizen have an obligation to vote. He voted every election from 1933 until he died in 2006. And he made sure that we registered, we were 21, and voted. He was dead set on that. That was an important thing to do.
Where was the shoe shop?
The original shoemaker shop was behind Dunkelberger's. Dunkelberger's was the Acme Market, but it was only half as long, and it was a wooden building back there. He was there about a year, and the Masonic Lodge owned it. And they came and they said they want to put an addition on for the Acme, so he moved the shoemaker shop up to North 6th Street across from Dennis's butcher shop. The building is still there. There's a hair salon in there. Prior to that, Dorenza's had his aluminum storm window place in there. But that's where he had his shoemaker shop until he moved down to 6th and Main Street.
And did he ever mention to you that he felt welcomed in?
He said he felt welcome. He didn't feel any signs of discrimination. But I want to share something with you. During the Second World War, the Germans were harassed by the FBI in Monroe County. He tells the story that he had. He was too old to be drafted, but he had a German Shepherd. And even though he was born in Germany, he considered himself an American citizen. He couldn't serve, but he donated his German Shepherd to the Army. And when the war was over, the sergeant that had him wrote a letter and said that he was through so much action with the dog, and they offered to retrain the dog back to civilian life, but he put in a personal request, could he keep the dog? And my father signed a release and said yes, he could keep the dog. But the stories he tells, he had a contract with the Tobahan Army Depot to fix shoes, military shoes, and he used to start working at 6 o'clock in the morning. And he said one morning he opened a shop and he happened to look across the street and he saw guys carrying cameras. And he looked up at the third floor and they pulled the shades up and he saw him putting a camera down facing his shop. For 2 weeks, they photographed everybody that came in and out of his shoemaker shop. This was during the Second World War. There was a German baker next to the Sherman Theater. His name was Graf, and he and his wife and children lived behind it. One night at midnight, the FBI came and took him away, didn't tell anybody where he was gone for 3 or 4 days. They thought they were German spies. After the 2-week period, the FBI came in the shop, in my father's shoemaker shop, identified themselves, and said they had reason to believe that they had shortwave radios, and they were checking out all the German people. They searched the house where we lived, and they took all the letters that his mother had written him in German, and they never returned them. But the baker finally came back. There was a man, he was a stonemason, he lived outside in Hamilton Township, didn't have any work in the wintertime, and he was, I think Thanksgiving was coming up, and he had a shotgun. He wanted to go out and shoot some rabbits so the family had something to eat. Somebody turned him into the FBI and they came and took the shotgun away from him. But there was harassment with the German people. There was another man who lived on Phillip Street and just got a ton of coal for the winter. And the FBI came and they said they had reason to believe that he had a shortwave radio hidden under the coal. And they made him shovel the coal from one side of the cellar to the other, and they didn't find a shortwave radio. After, I guess, almost a year of this harassment, the German people got together and hired a local lawyer. And the lawyer wrote the FBI a letter and said, if you have any evidence that these hard-working German people are spies, arrest them. Otherwise, stop harassing them. And he told the guy that shoveled the coal, he said, next time they come and they want you to shovel the coal, tell them, here's the shovel, you shovel it, and when you're finished, put it back where you found it. So, that was a tough period of time to be German. I remember in 3rd grade, I got into a tussle with another kid, and he called me a Nazi.
This was in the late 50s.
This is me, yeah. I went into Ramsey School, and I came home and I said to my father, what's a Nazi? He said, we don't talk about that. He said, we're Americans. But that period of time from like the mid-40s till the war was over, the German people had a difficult time in the area. And for the most part, they were hardworking business people, were proud to be Americans. But that was a dark part of Monroe County history.
I'm on the one hand surprised they wouldn't allow your father to serve because he was German. One would think he would have the language skills.
He only had one kidney.
Oh.
And so he had a physical.
So it wasn't because he was German.
No, it wasn't because he was German. I mean, there were Germans that they drafted, but he wanted to contribute something because in his mind he was an American. And even though, he had brothers that lived in Germany that fought in the German army, but he donated his dog and he, said he was an American. I remember personally, after the war, my mother used to go to the feed mill and get feed bags and pack coffee, 8 o'clock coffee. I remember the packs of them, and chocolate bars, and they would put them in cardboard boxes and then put the feed bags around them and sew them up and send the Railroad Express to New York, and then get them on a boat and send them to Europe. And they used to trade coffee and chocolate bars, for other things in there. It was a rough period of time after the war in Germany too, but I distinctly remember her sewing feed bags and so on, and then a Railroad Express took them and they sent them to Europe. Took 4 or 5 weeks for them to get there, but then they'd get a letter back thanking him for sending it over.
This is an interesting part of Stroudsburg history I don't think I've ever heard.
Yeah, it's, and as I say, every group that came to America, they've had their share of discrimination, although my father said the local people were very welcoming. And the Germans, even though they spoke with a German accent, for the most part, they were welcomed and they contributed to the business community. Reverend Wolson was the pastor of the Lutheran Church, and as soon as he heard a German came to town, he would go down and get him to come to the Lutheran Church, and that's how my father got to be a member of it.
This all happened before you were born. I'm just wondering, did your dad ever talk about the war or
Well, they talked about, I was born in 1944, and I remember, I have a good memory. I remember my 3rd birthday. I had a white birthday cake, but I remember these stories, and the Germans kind of still hung together. They actually formed a German club in the 50s. But, they told these stories and shared the stories that they had with the FBI coming and, accusing of being spies and so on. So, but they contributed a lot to the local economy in the way of, their trades. They were excellent bakers, butchers, machinists, and they, were proud to be Americans.
Well, let's get into your life, or we'll be getting tied down here talking about the 1940s. But so you're born in 44. Where were you living at? Where?
Lived on South 6th Street, and that's in Stroudsburg in those days. Was the main shopping center for the county. The Acme Market was there, the A&P, J.C. Penney's, Newberry's, Woolworths, Ray and Derrick's, of course, Wyckoff Sears. You could walk from 5th Street to 8th Street and look in store windows. That was entertainment for some people, look at all the retail windows, which brings up something else I remember very clearly. The building on 6th and Main, which later became Newberry's, J.J. Newberry was born in Stroudsburg. I don't know if you know that. Born on Scott Street. As was S.S. Kresge. He was born in Kresgeville and started the 5 and 10. But the first Newberry store was in Stroudsburg. Chud Bensinger, the lawyer, and Frank LaBar put together that parcel, I think 5 buildings, and the plan was to build a 6-story building and make it the national headquarters of J.J. Newberry. They bought the buildings, tore them down, and had the plans to build a 6-story building. And I remember walking past that, going to the Ramsey School. They hit quicksand. Now, most people don't remember that. But for 6 months, they pounded piles in the ground and determined they could only go 2 stories instead of the 6 or 7-story building.
How about that?
But I remember that we used to come home for lunch from the Ramsey School. They'd let you out for lunch, and you walked home, and then you walked back. And I remember walking past that and, hearing the pilings pounding. But that was supposed to be the national headquarters.
This would have been early 50s then.
Yeah, this would have been in the early 50s.
Huh.
Okay, what else did I miss here? J.J. Newberry. Some of the stories, S.S. Kresge had a summer home in Mountain Home. It was called Green Gables. And he was extremely frugal. And this was told to me by Marshall Reese, who was president of Buck Hill. He walked down to the Ray and Derrick store at Mountain Home one day because he didn't get his Wall Street Journal in the mail. And he bought a Wall Street Journal, and I think in those days they were 10 cents. And when he walked back home, his wife met him and said, "Oh, the mailman was here and he apologized for not leaving your paper, but here it is." So he said, "Well, I just bought one." So he turned around, he walked back down to the Ray and Derrick store and said he'd like to get his dime back. Here's the Wall Street Journal. And that story went around, when all through Monroe County.
Did you ever meet him yourself?
I did not meet him, but I sold his property after he died. His wife kept it for a while, and I wound up selling it probably in the late 80s. I sold it to Frank Buck, who had Frank Buck Motors. And he just died here a couple months ago, but he was somebody you should have interviewed too. He was a local.
Yeah, I've heard the name.
Born and raised, barely finished high school, but he became a multimillionaire in Monroe County.
Yeah.
But another thing which would be important, in those days, many of the people complained about the boarding houses and resorts, that they weren't contributing their fair share to the economy. The management of Buck Hill came up with a plan that they would pay all their employees and all their suppliers in silver dollars on a Friday. And then they would trace where those silver dollars went. And it was to show the Chamber of Commerce and the local newspaper that the resorts were in fact a main source of the economy.
Interesting.
So they paid all their help, paid all their bills with silver dollars, and they tracked it. And within a few hours, they were at gas stations, grocery stores, whatever else, and they traced them for a week where that money went. And they said that stopped the general trend of people saying that the resorts were not paying their fair share.
Clever, very clever. So let's get back to you. You went to Ramsey, and then I assume on to Stroudsburg High School, and then
Went to Stroudsburg High School.
did you go to college after that, or did you?
I'm sorry,
College or not?
College East Stroudsburg. People find this hard to believe. Stroudsburg High School was very proud of their rifle team, and I was a member of the rifle club. We would carry our 22 rifles to school, put them in our locker, and then at activity period, Mr. Woodley, who was the science teacher, who was in charge of the rifle, we went down to the basement of Stroudsburg High School, and they had targets there, and we shot our 22 rifles there.
Were you carrying bullets with you?
Yeah, you carried everything. You had your bullets in your pocket, and you put them in your locker, and when it was time for activity, you went and got your 22 and went downstairs. I mean, when I tell people that today, can you imagine if somebody carried a rifle to Stroudsburg High School today? We didn't have any guards at the door. I mean, it was a different time.
Yeah, well, this was before Route 80, right? We're talking...
Yeah, well,
before
before Route 80.
The,
I graduated from high school in '62, so it was in the '60s. But, people still can't believe that you carried your... And during hunting season, the boys that could drive to school, as many of the teachers, they had their shotgun in the back of their pickup truck or something. And I remember, once I had a driver's license, sometimes right after school, you could just go with a friend and hunt rabbits. Labar's rhododendron nursery, where Labar Village is now, they encouraged the kids to come in there and shoot the rabbits because they were eating the nursery stock. So we would oftentimes, take our shotgun to school, and then after school, come back through Labar Nursery and shoot a few rabbits. I mean, people just can't believe that when you tell them that.
Different times.
Different times. What else? I'll tell you an interesting story. You talked about Route 80. Before Route 80 was finished, all the traffic crossed at Water Gap Bridge and came up 611 over Foxdown Hill, over the 7th Street Bridge, turned left on Main Street, went up to 9th Street and turned right, and that was 611. I remember my uncle lived in Water Gap, and I remember traffic in the summertime would oftentimes be backed up over top of Foxdown Hill, where it's now, I think it's whatever the restaurant is on top of it. It used to be Gap View Inn when I was a kid, and then Tommy Cullen's. But all the traffic came over that way. Now, here's something that most people either don't remember or never knew about it. There was the police was local in Stroudsburg. They had the Stroudsburg Police Department, and there was a policeman named Charlie Allen who directed the traffic on 7th and Ann Street to get the traffic through because there was so much coming through. Stroudsburg had a mayor named Hal Harris, who originally came to Stroudsburg as a professional baseball player. And he was proudly to call himself a Roosevelt Democrat. And he was the mayor of Stroudsburg, and he stood down there one day when Charlie Allen was directing traffic and kept telling him, do this or do that. And Charlie Allen said, look, I'm in charge. The police chief told me what to do, and if you don't stop harassing me, I'm going to arrest you, put you in jail. And Hal Harris kept it up. Charlie Allen made good on his promise. He went over and he put handcuffs on Hal Harris, marched him up to 7th Street, put him in jail. He was in jail for about 15 minutes till somebody bailed. That story made Life magazine.
No kidding.
That the policeman arrested the mayor, put him in jail. When Hal Harris got out of jail, he wanted to get even. He moved Charlie Allen from 7th and Ann to 9th and Main, which was even worse directing traffic. Charlie Allen actually got hit with a truck there, and he was never the same after that. But he lived in South, and I remember that clear as anything when that happened. Now, another thing about Stroudsburg, the Penn Stroud, this is before my time, but this was a story that an unsolved bank robbery. 2 men came up and requested a corner room in the Penn Stroud Hotel. This was, I think, in the early 40s. And they stayed in the room, and the management said they didn't come out during the day. They came out at night to get something to eat. But what they were doing, they were surveilling the First Stroudsburg National Bank. And they found out when they came and brought the money. They held up the bank, they had stolen a car, and they drove to Menacing Hills to the landing there. There was a railroad bridge across there, and the piers are still in there. They ran across the railroad bridge to what was called Caramack Camp, which was on the New Jersey side. They had a car waiting for them there, but the caretaker of Caramack Camp was a German guy, and he said, what's going on here? They kidnapped him, threw him in the car. They drove down 46, and where King Cole is, they threw him out of the car. He was bruised but wasn't hurt. They didn't harm him that much. They never solved that. But that's an unsolved case of a bank being robbed in Stroudsburg. And his name was Ernie, and he wound up having what was called, it's now called Kittatinny Beach, but he bought that, and when we were kids, we used to go down there to swim. They called it Ernie's Beach. But that's another unsolved bank robbery in Stroudsburg. What else I tell you here? Newberry, whatever, Route 611, the mayor in jail. The flood of 1955. I remember that like it was yesterday.
So you're 11.
That was the bridge between Stroudsburg and East Stroudsburg was out. The Stokes' Mill Bridge was out, and the one on Pine Brook was out. So the towns were separated. I think somewhere around 70 people lost their life in that flood. But as kids, we thought it was great because it was August 18th and 19th, and they delayed the opening of school for, I think, 10 days or 2 weeks, and we just thought it was great. I remember going to Water Gap, and there were bungalows came floating down, and we had a great time. Boats and canoes and stuff came floating down the river. I made claim to a rowboat in a canoe, and we had them tied up there where the old railroad station was. And when school started, I guess somebody else took him, but the flood for us kids was a great time. But the lower end of Stroudsburg was really, underwater.
Yeah. You talked about walking up and down Main Street and how it was a lot more commercial than it is now, or there were more.
People came to town to shop. The Acme was here, the A&P.
What night? There was a night that town was open, right?
As a child, they were open Saturday nights till 9 o'clock. In later years, they changed it to Friday night till 9 o'clock. But people from the West End and farmers and so on, they would come in and their wife would do the shopping, and they would sit on the benches. And the streets were crowded in those days. Wyckoff's department store had a gimmick. a 5-cent Coca-Cola. And up until the time they closed, they never changed that. You could still buy a nickel Coke, and that was probably in the late 90s. You could still buy a Coke there. They had the distinction of having the only Sears franchise. During the Depression, Mr. Wyckoff made a deal with Sears to put the Sears store in their basement. So it became Wyckoff Sears. But I mean, Main Street was buzzing with retail activity.
You also mentioned, I'm wondering what a young man in high school did in Stroudsburg to amuse himself, besides hunting.
Kids, you entertained yourself. It was popular if you were a boy, you either played football, basketball, or baseball. They had a very active little league. If you were a hunter, every red-blooded boy had an absence the first day of deer season. They didn't give you off Monday, but every boy took off Monday. Mm-hmm. And I remember coming back in on Tuesday, you were supposed to have an excuse. Mr. Wells was the assistant principal, and he didn't even look up. He would give you an illegal absence. You came up and you gave him the excuse that your mother signed, that you weren't feeling well, or you had a cold or something. No excuses, illegal. Next, I mean, there was a line of boys out the door on Tuesday morning to come in. But that was just, you entertained yourself. There was no problems. The YMCA was active, which brings up another point. S.S. Kresge was a large donor to the expansion of the YMCA. Yeah. The town fathers made the mistake of sending him a letter and thanking him and giving him the progress. He sent him a postcard back, and he said, everything you told me in a letter, you could tell me in a penny postcard. Why do you waste a nickel when you could have done it for a penny? When they had the grand opening of the new YMCA, the rumor is that they introduced him and asked him to say a few words. And he got up and he said, I never made any money talking. And he turned around and sat down. So, but he funded a good portion of that.
Did you go to the Y?
Yeah, I mean, everybody. It was the center of town. You could go there and swim. You could play basketball in the wintertime. They had activities in there. You didn't have any issues. I mean, you didn't need a policeman there. The local police force, which is interesting, Jim McConnell was the chief of police. He had a Harley Davidson motorcycle, and whenever there was a parade, the Halloween parade or whatever, he would ride down Main Street to get the crowd back. He retired probably in the early 60s, and nobody knows whatever happened to the white Harley Davidson motorcycle that Chief Jim McConnell had. The rumor is when he came to town, being McConnell, he was Irish Catholic, but they told him that he would probably be better off if he changed to Protestant. And somehow Pastor Wilson heard about him, and he became a member of the Lutheran Church. But everybody knew, and McConnell Street is named after him. Coming up, that they did that after the flood, coming up from the bridge. That's named after Chief McConnell.
So getting back to the Y, did they have dances and things like that?
They had dancing there. I was not a good dancer, but they had dances there on Saturday night for the kids. And I think they had a chaperone, but there was never any problems.
And the day camp, did you go to their camp?
I'm sorry?
The camp in the summer, did you go to their
They had a camp in the summer. I think they used Sailor's Lake. They had a day camp, and they used to have the buses and the kids that went. My wife went to that. She was born and raised in Stroudsburg, went to the summer camp at Sailor's Lake, sponsored by the YMCA.
Well, let's get back to Jack Muehlhan. So you ended up selling real estate. How did you take us through from college, what you studied in college, and how you started your professional career?
Well, that was kind of interesting. I wanted to go to either Penn State or go out of town someplace and major in business administration. My father, who was frugal, said, I never went to college. If you want to go to college, there's a college in East Stroudsburg. You can go there, but I'm not going to pay for you to go out of town to college. So I remember I applied, it was accepted, and my advisor said to me, what do you want to major in? I said, well, I'd really like to major in business. And he said, we don't have a business program. We're mainly a teacher's college, specialized in phys ed, but he said, I have an idea. Why don't you major in elementary education? And he said, go for a quick master's, and then you can probably get to be principal of a small country school, and that's like running a business, and you can. So I took his advice, and it didn't take me long to figure out that I was not cut out to be an elementary school teacher. And it was kind of interesting. There was a lawyer in town who said to me, he said, what do you do summers? And I said, well, I get various jobs and so on. And he said, well, why don't you sell campsites? And he said, you can make some nice money doing that. So I got a real estate salesman's license and started selling campsites. Now in those days, a beginning teacher in the 60s made somewhere $5,000, $5,200, maybe $5,500. Memorial Day weekend, I think I made $1,800 or $1,900 in commission selling campsites. And I concluded that I think that's better than being an elementary school teacher. And that was my beginning into real estate.
And then you started your own business?
You have to serve an apprenticeship and get education and so on. It took 3 years to get a license. And I did that and got a license and then went out on my own. Let me tell you some other things that I remember very well. My senior year in high school, there was a man walked around Main Street. His name was Ed Maps, and he dressed like a hippie. Most guys in those days didn't wear Bermuda shorts. He wore Bermuda shorts and sandals, and he smoked a pipe, and he put himself out as an artist. He would often be seen on the art square in Stroudsburg. One of the part-time jobs I had was selling artwork at the artist things in summertime in the courthouse square. And I remember him very clearly. He lived on Sarah Street, and he would walk around there, and I think it was in January of 1962 when he allegedly killed his wife and child and set the house on fire. And I mean, that was the talk of the town. The firemen got there in time. James R. Marsh was district attorney, and they called him in and they said this was an intentional fire and Mrs. Maps is dead, and I think the baby died in the hospital. And he woke up Floyd Kellogg, who was the district, they called him Justice of the Peace, and he swore out a warrant for Maps's arrest. They went to the Colonial Diner, the Greyhound bus stop, and the March bus stop was at the American House, and they posted a policeman there, and they went to what was Walt's Diner, which is now the Fifth Street Diner, and they were open all night, and they put word, if Maps happened to show up there, arrest him. They have a warrant for his arrest. They never found him. But this is an interesting thing of Monroe County history. They found out later that he was friends with a man named Paul Haight, who worked in the East Stroudsburg Post Office and had a farm in Cherry Valley. When I was a Boy Scout, I was a Boy Scout in Troop 87 at the Presbyterian Church. To get a certain badge, you had to take a 5-mile hike. And Carl Cyphers and I were in Boy Scouts, and he got a couple other guys, and he said, my uncle is Paul Haight, and he owns a farm in Cherry Valley. And he said, we can walk out there and have lunch and walk back, and that'll be our 5-mile hike. So I remember we hiked out there, and the house was right on the bend in the road. It was a yellow house. We sat on the porch and we had our lunch, and I said, I really like this place. Someday I'm going to own it. And Carl said, no, my uncle owns it. You're never going to get it. I'm going to get it. Anyway, as it would be, Maps disappeared. They never found him. 25 years later, the house that Mapps lived in, or that Paul Haight lived in, burned down, and he used to live in the house, and he would leave and have breakfast at Waldsteiner and Fifth Street, drive back, and then he wore a Woolrich hunting coat, summer and winter. He was a little bit cooler, a bachelor, never married, and he would go and have dinner there. And he had a lot of antiques in the house. When he went for dinner one night, when he came back, his house was on fire, and the house burned down. Now, he died, and as I say, I was in my 30s then. I drove by that one day, and I saw a little for sale sign on there with the telephone number 421-5410, and I recognized that as Attorney Elmer Christine's telephone number. And I called him up and I said, I see you have the Paul Haight farm for sale. He said, yeah, he died, and he said he had 4 or 5 sisters, and they want to settle the estate, they want to sell it. And I said, I want to buy it. And he said, the price is firm. And I said, Elmer, I want this property. So anyway, I went up to the bank, and long and short of it, I talked Security Trust into lending me the money. I bought the farm. And I knew Mary Warden, who lived across the valley in what they call Stormsville. And George Warden, her son, became the prothonotary of Monroe County. Now, as fate would have it, I kept the land and got married, built a house up on the hill, and that's where we live. We live on the Paul Haight farm. But it was probably 20 years ago, 25 years ago, we went to a Monroe County Historical Society dinner, a fundraiser. My wife and I walked in, and Mary Warden was sitting there with some other lady, and she said, why don't you come over and sit with us? So we went over and sat, and she introduced us to her friend, and she said, the Muehlhans owned a Paul Haight farm. I'm going to tell you a funny story about that. The night Ed Mapps disappeared, Paul Haight always went to bed when it got dark. And she said, for some reason or other, we looked out across the valley, and it was midnight, and Paul Haight had lights on in his house. Now, I'm getting a little ahead of myself. After Ed Mapps had the burned down house there and disappeared, his estate, sold the property on Sarah Street. And who do you suppose bought it? Paul Haight. And he fixed up the house, and it was a tourist attraction. He called it the Mystery House, and he charged people to get in. Now, that all came together when Mary Warden said 11 o'clock or 12 o'clock the night that Mapps killed his wife and daughter, the light was on at Paul Haight's house. Mike Mancuso and David Christine know about this, and they came out to our farm looking and wondering if he could be. Now, we have 40 acres, so they don't know where, but they actually came out and tried to look around and just wondered if maybe Ed Mapps didn't come out there and either killed himself or Paul Haight killed him or something. But it just, the pieces are still, it's an unsolved murder, unsolved mystery.
Yeah.
That Paul Haight bought his property after it was burned. Mary Warden saw lights on it. Never told anybody till 25 years later.
And they've never found Mapps. So
they never found him. He's still missing. He was on the FBI's most wanted list for years. They just came to the conclusion that he would have to be dead by now because of his age and so on. But that's tied in. Somehow or other, he knew Paul Haight, and that my theory was that you could walk out there. I mean, I've walked from our farm into town, and you could do it in about an hour. Now, in those days, there wasn't much traffic at night. Could he have walked from there over the hill, woke up Paul Haight, and either Paul Haight hit him out or something? But that's an unsolved part of Monroe County history.
You must have lots of interesting stories about property and when you sell property to people.
Well, let me tell you some interesting stories. Where the Hampton Inn is in Stroudsburg, I remember that was Hilliard's truck farm, and we used to buy corn there, fresh corn. That was a farm, and they maybe did some other things for a living, but they sold produce in the summertime. Next to that, where ESSA's administrative building is, there was a butcher shop, and that was Dennis's butcher shop. He had a butcher shop on 6th Street, which I passed every day walking to the Ramsey School, and he used to butcher his steers there and chickens and everything else. The rest of it was Sam Rubin's junkyard, and that was established a wild thing in Stroudsburg, the truck farm. I sold that property. I sold the Hampton Inn, and when I tell them that I remember as a child, that was a cornfield where the Hampton Inn is. I tried to calculate it. In my career, in my 50-some years, I've sold over 2,000 properties in Monroe County.
No kidding.
One of them being Green Gables, which was the Kresge estate.
Yeah.
What else can I tell you?
That's still standing, that building. Some other family owns that.
I told you about Hal Harris. Oh, this would be interesting. Where Starbucks is, that was the Colonial Diner. There was a diner there, and it was owned by a man named Carl Cole. He was kind of an entrepreneur and a businessman, and Monroe County was predominantly Democratic in those days. Elmer Christine, who became a Republican district attorney in the early 50s, told the stories when the Republicans won a seat on the school board. They actually celebrated because it was a Democratic county. But Hal Harris was the mayor of Stroudsburg, and the rumor was he had connections. He was a Roosevelt Democrat. The original Stroudsburg post office was on South 6th Street behind Dunkelberger's parking lot. And if you look up, you can still see the Pennsylvania emblem there. But Stroudsburg decided it needed a new post office, as did East Stroudsburg. Hal Harris got enough funding for a marble post office at 7th and Ann. East Stroudsburg just got brick. Hal Harris also got money for central sewer in Stroudsburg in the 30s and early 40s. East Stroudsburg never got central sewer until I was driving a car, so it would have had to have been in the 60s. And I remember the streets being dug up there. But Hal Harris was well connected. But Carl Cole was in the diner one night, and they determined that they were going to put up a candidate to run against Hal Harris. No Republican would do it. He had a dishwasher named Dickerson, and I forget his first name, but his nickname was Sweat Dickerson. And they decided they're going to run him against Hal Harris, and he was a Republican. Nobody knows how they got the signatures that quick, but they got enough signatures to get him on the petition, and he ran against Hal Harris. He couldn't drive a car, he rode a bicycle, and he smoked a pipe. And the logo was Sweat Dickerson for mayor. Vote for the man that rides a bike. Vote for the man that smokes a pipe. Sweat Dickerson. Hal Harris creamed him, but anyway, they put up a candidate to run against him. But Carl Cole actually built the building, which is now ESSA's bank building. He built that and rented it to Montgomery Ward. That was Montgomery Ward's store. And he also owned the farm on Chipperfield Drive where the middle school is. He was a wheeler dealer in real estate. He built the first bowling alley, the first modern bowling, and there was one on 6th Street, but he built what was Colonial Lanes on 611, and I remember that. That was in the late 50s, early 60s. The newspaper interviewed him and said, "Are you a bowler?" He said, "I never bowled in my life, but I'm happy to provide the facility." And he was very successful with that. What else do you... Okay. The Pocono Record, which used to be called the Daily Record, was the local newspaper. And they would cover all the township meetings and cover the courthouse and everything else. And they were left-leaning. But Elder Township, which is in the western part where Kunkletown is, the predominant language there in my lifetime yet was Pennsylvania Dutch. Most people out there spoke Pennsylvania Dutch. They got a new newspaper reporter about the time they enacted the Sunshine Law, that any government business had to be done in open. You couldn't discuss it in a back room. So when it came to Elder Township, they sent their new Penn State graduate reporter to Elder Township to cover the meeting. And when an item came up that the supervisors didn't want in the newspaper, they started talking Pennsylvania Dutch. She complained, and the newspaper ran a story and said that they're not complying with the Sunshine Law, and they're going to have their attorney look into this. The solicitor for Elder Township said, Pennsylvania Dutch is the predominant language in Elder Township, so we suggest if your newspaper reporter doesn't understand it, they learn Pennsylvania Dutch if they want to come here and cover our meetings. That's a historical fact. But some of the other things, Monroe County had a lot of national companies. Most people don't remember Ronson cigarette lighters, but that was in Water Gap. And I remember the 1955 flood, that land was owned by a German named Otto Gemm. And he had a boarding house there. And they came and they said they want to put Route 80 through there. So they condemned it and paid him whatever fare was. And he said 2 weeks before the flood, or a month before the flood, a man came and knocked on his door and he said he just drove over the new highway and he wants to buy that field. It was Mr. Ronson. He wanted to put a plant there. They made a deal. He closed on it, and 2 weeks later, the flood came and the next day backed up and that was all underwater. If you remember my interview for Water Gap, I rode around on a boat and Otto Gemm was in that boat. And of course, he thought it was funny. He said he sold out to the highway, he sold out to Ronson just in time. Now the whole thing's underwater. But I think you remember that part. We went down there. There was German people that had a bakery in Stroudsburg that lived where the Gulf station is, which incidentally I sold in later years for them to the Gulf station. But we went down to move their furniture from the first to the second floor because the floodwaters backed up. And after we did that, Otto Gemm and my father, being German, thought they should have a beer. And we rode up Broad Street in Water Gap and went under the traffic light, docked the boat, and walked up to what was the Cherry Valley Inn. I had I think a birch beer, and they had a beer, and the boat was there. And I remember this too, like clear as anything. We walked back down to get in the boat, and that picture just stuck in my mind. Went back to where the cars were, took the boat home, everything else, the waters receded. Whatever it was, 40 years later, I sold the Mountain House at Water Gap for the Hausers. And after I sold it, they invited my wife and me for dinner, and we had dinner there and reminisced and so on. And she got out some pictures, and she said, here's some pictures of the flood, and here's a picture that I never knew who the people were. And she showed it to me, and it was me, my father, and Otto Gemm getting in the boat. And I said, I can't believe it. I said, that picture was in my mind for years, and here you're handing it to me.
I remember this.
Yeah. So anyway, but there were other national businesses. International Boiler Works made boilers and sent them all over the world. That was in East Stroudsburg. The plant is still there, some of it, but that was a major employer. Stroudsburg Engine Works, which is now the antique market down there, they make shrimp hoists. I mean, they were the largest manufacturer of shrimp hoists for shrimp boats. There was a brewery down there. Worthington Moore made golf course moors for all over the world. They were a big employer. Hughes Printing Company employed hundreds. They ran 3 shifts a day. East Stroudsburg and the lower part of Stroudsburg, I mean, major industries there. all that's gone. But I remember that in my lifetime. The Tox Island Dam, that's a favorite story. They came out with that, and they said, we're all going to have boats. You're going to have a 40-mile lake. Nancy Shakaitis, who was Blanchard Michaels' daughter, and Blanchard Michaels had a farm up there on the Delaware River, and he used to charge $1 a car full to use the beach. But it was on the honor system. You came in on some, and our family, my father oftentimes took us there, piled a bunch of kids in the car, you put $1 in the bucket, and you could picnic and swim there all day. Nancy Shakaitis said that dam can never be built. The senior engineering class at Lehigh University has done study after studies that will never support a dam. Everybody looked at her as a farm girl. She single-handedly fought that, and she finally, under the Lyndon Johnson administration, got it defunded, and instead of a dam, it became a national recreation area. And I remember that clearly as anything. She said, they asked her, what gave you the incentive to fight? And she said, they thought I was a dumb farm girl, but they made the mistake. They got me mad. And she fought that, and she single-handedly started it. She became the first woman county commissioner. She then ran for commissioner. I had the privilege of knowing her she knew me since I was a kid. When I got my broker's license, she put me on the county planning commission. I was 25 or 26 years old, and it shook the political establishment, and she said, it's time for a younger person to get on the county planning commission. But the first woman lawyer in town was Lois Mirandon, and I worked with her. I worked with the first woman commissioner, and the first female judge was Judge Miller, and I was active in her campaign. What else can I tell you?
You've been central to a lot of the doings in Monroe County. I mean,
I'm sorry.
You've been central to a lot of events and things that happened in Monroe County.
Again, my bringing up was you have an obligation to give back and get involved in the community. And I say I never missed an election. I always backed what I thought was the best candidate. I sometimes got in trouble with the Republicans because I was a Republican and I backed a Democrat, but I thought they were the right person. Nancy Shakaitis went on to run for state representative, and she asked me to be co-chairman of her campaign, and I said I would. She ran against Joe Batista, who was a very popular Democrat, and we raised a lot of money. It was a clean campaign, but Nancy Shakaitis lost and Joe Batista won. That was Wednesday morning. We found out that he had won. Thursday morning, I got a call from Joe Batista. Now, I was the Republican that backed his opponent. And I picked up the phone. He said, Jack, this is Joe Batista. And I said, good morning, congratulations, thinking I'm toast now. And he said, I want to tell you something. He said, you ran a clean campaign. And he said, in politics, there's a winner and there's a loser. And he said, I won. But he said, I am now your state representative. I want you to know anything you need, anytime I can help you, you call me. I mean, that was the way politics were in Monroe County in those days.
Yeah.
And he would call me if he thought the Republicans should vote one way on something, and I had influence with commissioners or township supervisors, and up until the time of his retiring, had a wonderful relationship. It wasn't the Democrat Party of today, but we worked together. It was just for the good of the community. Something else that many people don't know. Percy Crawford, Pine Brook. Does that ring a bell with you?
Yeah,
okay.
sure, yeah.
Radio and television evangelism actually got its start in Monroe County. Percy Crawford was a pioneer radio evangelist in Philadelphia. He started Pine Brook Bible Conference. One of his early speakers was a man named Billy Graham. And he told Billy Graham, he said, I'm local. And he said, I'm up and down the East Coast. I'm on national radio. But it's time for a young evangelist to become a national figure and have crusades in major cities. And he said, I think you should do it. The first year you'll starve to death. But he said, there's time to do that. And he took his advice. And Billy Graham spoke at Percy Crawford's funeral and said he was the man that inspired me to go nationwide with citywide crusades in television. But he got a start in Pine Brook.
Did you used to listen to that show, that radio show?
I'm sorry?
The Percy Crawford show, did you used to listen to that?
Yeah, well, Percy Crawford, I mean, was for his time, he was radio evangelism, television evangelism. He started the King's College. Billy Graham got a start there. His son, Dr. Dan Crawford, wrote a book about him a couple of years ago, and I just glanced at it the other night to get some of my facts straight, but it was, I think, 1946 or 47 that Billy Graham came there. Percy Crawford died in 1960, and Billy Graham spoke at his funeral in Philadelphia. Mm-hmm. But that all started in Monroe County, and Billy Graham he's dead now, but he will admit that's where he got his encouragement from.
The reason I ask is because you know my Uncle John and Aunt Jean, when I was a kid and I'd be at their house, they would have that show on the radio. They'd be listening to his show. So I wondered if
From Percy Crawford, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, he had a daily radio program on WVPO called Pine Brook Praises. He had another national radio program called the Young People's Church of the Air. And then his television programming was Youth on the March. Now, that's an interesting thing. There was a man who used to sing in Percy Crawford's quartet. His name was Wally Hoffman. And he bought the property known as Birchwood and started a honeymoon resort. But he was on the board of the King's College in Briarcliff Manor, New York. I got to know him, and he never had a son, and he said that I was the son he never had. And he called me one day, and this was in the late 60s, early 70s, and he said, Dr. Robert A. Cook, who's president of the King's College, is coming to have lunch with me. And he said, I'd like you to meet him. And I said, well, what's the purpose of the meeting? He said, I might as well tell you, he's looking for money. Every year, he wants to balance the funds of the college, balance the books, and he said their fiscal year ends in June, and he's coming to have lunch, so he said, I'd like you to meet him. So Wally was awful good to me, and I went there and had lunch, met Bob Cook, and Wally got a call. He was a pilot for Pan American also, in addition to running the resort. And I finished lunch with Bob Cook, and Bob Cook said to me, Wally's coming up in a couple of weeks to bring a check to the college, and he said, I'd like you to come with him. And I said, why? He said, I'd like you to see the college. And he said, I'm looking for a young guy to come on the board, and he said, I think you're the guy. So I was 26 or 27 when I got on the board of the King's College. Oh. When Bob Cook retired, the new president wanted him 100 miles from the college. I sold Bob Cook a house. Bob Cook had a national radio program called Walk with the King, which he recorded in Tannersville in the house he lived in. And he's since died. His daughter still has it. That program is still on national radio, but that was recorded here in Monroe County.
How about that?
Now, what else can I tell you? Percy Crawford's son, Dr. Dan Crawford, wrote a book. You can get it. I think it's called A Thirst for Souls, and that tells everything, probably more than I could have told you. I remember meeting Jackie Gleason at the Penn Stroud Hotel. Friday night, we were walking downtown, a group of kids, and somebody said, that's Jackie Gleason sitting in there having dinner. And I remember walking in, and I said, pardon me. I said, are you Jackie Gleason? He said, yes, I am. Who are you? And I told him, and I said, could I have your autograph? He said, sure. And he took a napkin and wrote down, best of luck, Jackie Gleason. you heard the story about him shooting pool at the Blue Note Inn?
Yeah.
Should we tell that story? Or
Sure,
not?
go ahead. But do you still have that napkin?
I don't, and I looked for that the other night somewhere. I don't know. I moved my office and whatever. It's somewhere, but I couldn't find it.
Yeah.
But I did find one from Pat Williams from the Orlando Magic. He spoke at the prayer breakfast, which I started. I have his autograph. I found that the other night, but did not find Jackie Gleason's. But Jackie Gleason would stay at Shawnee Inn, and at night he would go over to the Blue Note Inn, which the building was where I think the towing place is now on 611.
It's next to it. It's where Mountain Modal is now.
Yeah.
Mountain Modal, that's the place.
But he would go over there and shoot pool.
Yeah.
And the story is that he was playing for money, but he had a little too much to drink, and they were playing for money, and he wound up $10,000 in the hole. His business manager came the next day. They negotiated a deal, and I think they gave the guy $1,000 or something to settle it. But he would often come over there and shoot pool, as did Jackie Gleason. Jack Kennedy visited Buck Hill Falls. Marshall Reese told me that the FBI came in a couple days before that and went through the kitchen, went through everything else, and the Secret Service and so on, and he came to Buck Hill Falls. You need to know about somebody else. Dale Learn, when I became a realtor, a broker, he was still active in the Board of Realtors. Now, in those days, there were 7 members of the Board of Realtors. Today, I think there are 700. But we used to meet at the Beaver House. My first meeting there, I didn't drink, but the rest of them did. They'd have a martini before lunch, during lunch, and after lunch. And Dale Learn came up to me and he said, "I'm so glad." He said, "I understand you're a teetotaler." And he said, "I'm a teetotaler." And he said, "I'm so glad we have another realtor here that I have something in common with." But Dale Learn was born and raised in Monroe County at a property in Paradise Township known as Farm on the Hill. He was born and raised there. He's the only man from Monroe County who ever ran for governor and also ran for vice president on a Prohibition ticket. Now, he didn't win either one, but he had lived in East Stroudsburg, outside of East Stroudsburg on a farm. He was president of the Pennsylvania Realtors Association, and he was active in the Methodist Church in East Stroudsburg, and he only died, I want to say, in the late 90s. But his 2 sons and grandsons, the family is still there. But Dale Learn, born and raised in Monroe County, ran for vice president of the United States and also governor. George Graff, who wrote the song "When Irish Eyes Are Smiling," lived in the Penn Stroud Hotel. I recently told the new owner of that, and he wants to put a plaque out there. Frank Sinatra oftentimes came to Mount Airy Lodge. The honeymoon business in the 60s, the Pocono Mountains were known as the honeymoon capital of the world. The heart-shaped bathtub was invented here, and there were probably a half a dozen honeymoon resorts. Wally Hoffman, who had Birchwood, still flew for Pan Am, and he came back one day. He landed in Kennedy Airport from a European trip, and he gave 3 stewardesses rides back to their apartments in New York. And he came back and he said, "The honeymoon business is going to be over with." He said, "I took 3 stewardesses back to their apartments. None of them were married. They were all living with a guy." And he said, "People aren't going to get married. They're just going to live together." He predicted that 10 or 15 years ahead of its demise. But he saw that coming. But it was once the honeymoon capital of the world. Birchwood, honeymoon haven. Another first in Monroe County, the first indoor swimming pool was built at a boarding house which was called Farm on the Hill, which was the farm that Dale Learn was born on. That was a boarding house, but they built the first indoor pool, and I think I passed there a couple months ago. The building is still there, but that was the first indoor swimming pool.
Did you ever see it?
I'm sorry?
Did you ever see the pool?
Yeah. The German club held a picnic there one winter, and everybody was allowed to swim in the indoor pool.
Oh, yeah.
Once the German club got started, I mean, they came out and they had an active program here. Unfortunately, the next generation didn't follow through on it. The older ones died off. The club only dissolved about 10 years ago. But that was, I remember that swimming in the indoor pool. Now, I'll tell you a little bit about the political structure. I remember when Monroe County and Pike County shared a judge. There was one judge for the two counties. The judge would hear cases in Monroe County and then go hear cases in Pike County. I was just getting started in business. It would have been probably the mid-60s or so. And James R. Marsh, who was a Democrat, by then the county had switched to Republican. And Arlington Williams was a long-time practicing attorney. He was solicitor for East Stroudsburg Savings, and he ran for judge. James R. Marsh was a Democrat who ran against him. He was district attorney. He ran against him, and Arlie Williams won. Several years after that, Milton Shapp, who was a Democratic governor, became governor. Monroe County was approved for a second judge. And the story goes that Milton Shapp, James R. Marsh, who lost to Arlie Williams, became chairman of the Democratic Party. Monroe County was approved for a second judge, as was Pike County. It was still in the 43rd Judicial District. And Milton Shapp called the chairman of the Democratic Party, James R. Marsh, and said, "The Senate just approved another judge. I want you to recommend a good candidate that I can appoint that can fill in the seat until the next election and then run and win so we get a Democratic judge up there. Why don't you think about it and get back to me?" And James R. Marsh allegedly said, "I don't have to think about it. I can give you the name right now." And he said, "Who is it?" He said, "Me." So he got it approved, got it through the Senate. Forrest Sebring was a Republican sheriff. He came down to his office in the courthouse and he said, "Forrest, the Senate just approved me to be judge. I'm going to Harrisburg to pick up my papers." And he said, "Why don't you ride with me?" And Sheriff Sebring said, "Jim," he said, "they're going to mail it to you. Why do you want to ride to Harrisburg in all those traffic?" And he said, "I don't trust those S of the B's down there. I'm going down and get my credentials." And he drove down and drove back, and he was judge. Okay, Arlie Williams, remember that, how he got that. And the story was that Jim Marsh would tell, on beautiful spring days when there was court in Pike County, Judge Williams would ride and said, "I'll take them." When there was snow and ice on the road, he said, "Jim, you're going to Pike County." So he stated. Finally, they split off and Pike County got their own judge, and Judge Marsh won. But as I said, Republicans were starting to gain strength. There was a guy I grew up with, who was a year ahead of me in school, Carl Yost. He became a teacher. He was a year older than I was, and he taught school in Elder Township, Pennsylvania Dutch. There was a job in those days. The county treasurer, the county commissioners, the prothonotary were making about $6,000 or $7,000. I think the sheriff got $6,500 or something. The office of register and recorder, register of wills and recorder of deeds, was on a commission basis. So the register and recorder was making, because the real estate boom was starting to happen in Monroe County, was making about $25,000 or $26,000 a year. Carl Yost wanted to get in politics. He was 21 years old, and he said, "I don't like teaching school. I'm going to run for register and recorder." And everybody said, "You can't win," the establishment. And he said, "I'm going to run and I'm going to win." And he came out with this program. He thought of this all himself. He said, if I win, I'm going to keep $8,500, and I'm going to donate the rest back to the county as a general contribution. And he came up with the slogan, "Save the most, vote for Yost." Okay, they had the Republican primary. The headquarters was on South 7th Street, and which is now the Cone Law Office. election night, the Republican candidate was a man named, I forget his last name, it'll come to me. Anyway, the ballots came in and Carl Yost won. He beat the Republican favorite. Now, he still had to run against a Democrat. One of the power brokers, I won't mention his name, came up to Carl Yost. He said, "Carl, congratulations, now you're our man." And he had a fistful of money, and he gave it to him. He said, "You're our man." And Carl Yost took the money and put it back, and he said, "No, I'm not going to tell you his name. I'm my own man. You didn't back me in the primary. I don't want you to back me now." And he ran against a Democrat. He was 22 years old. He was sworn in as registered recorder. So he beat the system. That, I think, made national headlines. And the interesting thing was, all the lawyers used to come in there in those days, and I remember he was in there about a year, and he called me one day and he said, "I want to tell you my plans. I'm going to become a lawyer. I'm going to law school." And he applied to Temple at night. He ran the recorder's office in the daytime, went to Temple Law School. He became a lawyer, and he ran for the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania. Now, he didn't win, but first he ran for common pleas court judge against the establishment. In those days, well, you can still do it, you can cross-file. The two candidates that he ran against each admitted to spending $150,000. Now, 40 years ago, that was a lot of money. He spent $2,700. He got more votes than they did, but he didn't get enough on either ticket to win. Because you could cross-file, and he cross-filed, but he was a top vote getter, but didn't get enough on either ticket, so he was bumped off in the primary. But then he went and ran for the state Supreme Court, and this is something that many people don't know. He caught the attention of a man named Jerry Falwell, who was a radio TV evangelist and started an organization called the Moral Majority. He heard about Carl Yost, and he contacted him. He said, "The Moral Majority can't endorse you." But he said, I checked you out, I checked your record, and he said, "I as an individual can endorse you. If you will pay for the postage, I will write to everybody that's on my mailing list in Pennsylvania and endorse you." Now, nobody could figure out how Carl Yost got endorsements in 67 counties and was on the ballot there, but Jerry Falwell put him on the ballot. He didn't win, but he ran on statewide. He then became a lawyer in Eldra Township, and he died last year. But he was one who shook the establishment, made national headlines with a "Save the Most, Vote for Yost," and they still couldn't figure out how he did so well in Pennsylvania and didn't spend any money doing it. Now, what else can I tell you here? Okay, I remember one Sunday afternoon I walked past the jail, and the police were just getting there. The jail on 7th Street, a prisoner had attacked I guess he was the night watchman there or something, killed him, and jumped out of the second-story window and ran away, but he killed the guy. Forrest Seymour was sheriff then. They finally got the guy and caught him and killed him. I mean, put him in jail. They didn't give him the death penalty, but he actually killed a jail guard at 7th Street, and I remember that.
You were a kid at this point, or?
I'm sorry?
How old were you roughly when this?
Well, that was in the late 60s or early 70s.
Okay.
And another thing Monroe County was famous for, murdered the jail guard. There was a state trooper on Interstate 80 just above Columbia that stopped a car, and they were, I guess, what, terrorists and part of that 1970s terrorist movement, and one of the guys in there was wanted. Anyway, he shot and killed the guy. His name was LaMonaco, and disappeared. It took a year to catch the people, but they were living outside of Marshall's Creek. in there. And they were on the FBI's most wanted list. There's a number of unsolved murders in Monroe County that are still unsolved. The Buck Hill Inn, this would have been in the early 70s. A taxi driver picked up somebody in front of the Buck Hill Inn, and the guy killed him. They never solved that murder. His wife, his widowed wife, I guess it was a couple months later, got a call from somebody, and she told her kid she's going someplace, and her car somehow ran off the road and she was killed. Those two murders have never been solved. The guy that owned the Sycamore Grill, Jubier, killed at Water Gap.
Jubier.
That's an unsolved murder.
Yeah.
The Gross boy was killed at the Point of the Gap. That was all in my recent lifetime. That's an unsolved murder. The Ed Maps thing.
You grew up where this was all happening during
This
your
all
lifetime.
happened in my lifetime. If I could make a prediction, Tox Island, Nancy Shikida said there'll never be a dam there, and she was right. They had been talking about, prior to that, the old timers told me that one of the things before the Tox Island Dam was the Skyway. Some politician got the bright idea to do something like the Blue Ridge Parkway over the Kittatinny Mountains and over Mount Mincy, and we were all going to get rich when the Skyway came in. Never happened. Tox Island never happened. They're now talking about, as they have for 40 years, the train to New York. If I can go down and make a prediction, it will never happen, because it's just a political lie. Number one, that doesn't go to New York. The train tracks go to Hoboken.
Mm-hmm.
So tell it like it is. It's going to be from the Poconos to Hoboken or Scranton to Hoboken. Number two, the tracks run through Water Gap. The high-speed train is supposed to go. If you go to the Point of the Gap, and I'm sure you know this, there's a train in the Delaware River. You can go there in low water and you can look in there and see it. That came around there at 15 miles an hour and couldn't make the curve and is in the bottom of the river. Metro North, running from New York to Westchester County, has yet to show a profit. How the train will show a profit from Scranton or the Poconos to Hoboken, again, my prediction is it will never happen. I share this with the Railroad Authority, and I said, how do you plan to get across the Delaware River? And they said, the viaduct at Slateford. And I said, have you ever walked down there, park your car in Slateford, and walk across it? And you tell me if you think that's going to hold a train. And I invite any of you to do that. You can park your car there, climb up and walk across it, and you see if that's going to hold a train. When I shared that with the chairman of the Railroad Authority, I said, I will offer to take you down there and walk across it, and you tell me if that's going to hold a train. He said, if it doesn't, we'll just build a new bridge. And I said, I want to call to your attention, it took you 10 years to get the permission to build a bridge over the Marshall's Creek, which is only 15 feet wide. How are you going to get permission from the Park Service, from the state of New Jersey, the state of Pennsylvania, and it will never happen. That's the Jack Muehlhan prediction. The train will never run to New York.
Jack, let me ask you a question. You grew up here. You were. I didn't realize how central you were. You know, rubbing elbows with the movers and shakers, and you were a mover and shaker yourself. So here's the question: How's Poconos changed? How has it changed since you were a kid? What's the biggest change you think?
The biggest change, in my opinion, happened for two reasons. Number one, when they built Route 80. I remember my father had an aunt in New York. If you would leave Stroudsburg and drive to New York on Route 46, it was a 3-hour ride. And a lot of it was 2-lane and whatever else. So it couldn't be a commute. Once Route 80 got finished, it became an easy commute. Real estate was cheaper here than in New York or New Jersey, so people started to commute. The next thing, in my opinion, was the timeshare industry. It brought people that could never afford to have stayed at Shawnee or other resorts. They came up here for a week and they saw the area and they liked it and decided to stay. Growing up in downtown Stroudsburg, we never locked our house door. There was no reason to. I remember one Sunday we were going to New York to visit Aunt Flo, and I think we got as far as Hackettstown, and my mother couldn't remember if she shut the stove off. So she called a next door neighbor, who was Dr. Sweeney, and said, would you go up and just check and see if I shut the stove off? Now, it's interesting, the door wasn't locked. Mrs. Sweeney didn't say, well, where's the key? She knew the door was unlocked. So she walked up, she checked the house, and apparently if it was on, she shut it off or whatever else, but there was no reason to lock it. As I said, I remember there was no reason to lock your car. I remember lawyers would park on the courthouse square. One lawyer in particular had a Mercedes-Benz, and he would leave the keys in it. And you could walk by and see a car there with the keys in it. Can you imagine doing that today? I mean, the influx of people. Housing was cheap, and unfortunately, when they came, they brought the problems they were trying to escape and brought them here. The worst a kid in my generation growing up might have been when a kid was 18, you would drive to Port Jervis and you could buy a beer when you were 18 in New York State. Nowadays, I mean, you have drugs, open drug deals on Main Street and whatever. I mean, it's changed. I understand progress. I'm not opposed to development, but one of the things, when Mrs. Shakaitis put me in the County Planning Commission, she said, your job as commissioners is to help every township and every borough in Monroe County that doesn't have a planning commission to have their own planning commission so that they can control growth and do it locally. There was nine planning commission members, a full-time director and a full-time secretary. We worked as hard as we could to get townships and help them to build a planning commission. There are 16 townships and 4 boroughs in Monroe County. We suggested, look, and every township was required to have an industrial zone, a commercial zone. We tried to get some of the rural townships and say, look, why don't you take your bordering property and make that commercial and keep the rest in open space or residential. You couldn't get these townships, their positions were, it's our township, nobody's going to tell us what to do with it. But we tried our best to get them to work together and say, let's have the commercial area here. You can combine 3 townships and get credit for that. The rest of it can be farmland or open space and so on. You couldn't convince them of that. They all wanted to do it their own way. So you have a patchwork. You have one township has a residential district backing up to a commercial district in the other township. That was a fallacy. Today, we were instructed to put ourselves out of business, help every township and every borough, 4 boroughs, 16 townships, to form their own planning commission. And then you're out of business. Today, the county planning commission has, 8 or 10 full-time workers. Every township has its own planning commission, and you have a patchwork of, as I say, that's progress, and I'm not opposed to it, but it could have been done differently. And I go up to the Adirondacks and so on, and I think, it could have been like this.
Right.
As I said, I'm not opposed to development, but the outdoors, you got to have trees and woods and open space too. You can't have everything blacktop and paved over.
Well, we've been talking for a while now, and it's been fascinating. Let me ask you this. You were involved in so many things. Looking back, what was the thing you're most proud of, or the most important thing you did?
I'm glad you brought that up. I forgot about it. Okay. You're talking about the Pocono Leadership Prayer Breakfast.
Okay.
Okay. Somewhere, I think it was in Molly's restaurant, which incidentally, Molly's used to be in East Stroudsburg, and I sold them the old Newberry building, which was later was Endicott Johnson, and they put their restaurant in there. And it was a popular place to meet in the morning. And there was a guy in there who said, you might be interested in this. Here's a tape of a mayor's prayer breakfast. And I remember it was a cassette, and I was going someplace in my car and I listened to it, and it was a mayor of some town out west. Once a year they would have a program and bring the community leaders in and have an inspirational message. And I thought to myself, Monroe County ought to have something like that. So I remember I talked to a couple guys who I thought might be interested, and I said, why don't we do a prayer breakfast? But instead of calling it a mayor's prayer breakfast, since there's 4 municipalities in Monroe County, Water Gap, Mount Pocono, Stroudsburg, and East Stroudsburg, why don't we just call it a leadership prayer breakfast? So anyway, they all thought it was a good idea, but when it came time to do the work, they nominated me as chairman. So I didn't know where to start, and I thought, well, a good place to start would be have the breakfast at a really nice place, the Stroudsmore. So I went to the Stroudsmore and talked to Andy Ford, and I said, Andy, we want to do this community thing, a breakfast at 6 o'clock in the morning, and that your new ridge crest is a beautiful view of Cherry Valley. We'd like to have it in there. And he said, how many people are going to come to this? And I said, well, our goal is 50. And he said, Jack, I'm not going to open Ridgecrest for 50 people. He said, if you want to have it, you can have it at the inn in the dining room. That seats 50 people. I said, no, we want it at Ridgecrest. And it's nice view, it'll nicer. He said, if you want Ridgecrest, you have to guarantee 100 people. And I said, Andy, this is not the Bible Belt. He said, do you decide? Let me know what you want to do. Ridgecrest or the hotel. Ridgecrest 100, the hotel you can bring your 50. And I said, I want Ridgecrest. He said, all right. He signed the bottom line. So I signed it and started to promote the thing. The first morning we brought in a national speaker. The first morning we had it, 240 people showed up. They ran out of bacon, they ran out of eggs, they ran out of everything. It was a great program, and we decided we wanted to do it next year. Andy told me, he said, Jack, look, he said, we're a business place, a resort. I can't handle 240 people here at 6 o'clock in the morning. Thank you for your business, but take it someplace else next year. So I went to see the folks at Camelback, and I said, would you consider opening your ski lodge for a community breakfast? And Sam Newman was chairman of Camelback, and he said, how many people? I said, well, we had 240 at Stroudsmore. He said, our room seats 480. And he said, we'll open it up, we'll do it for you, but you need to guarantee that we're going to fill the room. And I said, Sam, to go from 240 to 480, he said, we're not going to open up and fry eggs and scramble eggs here for 240 people. That's 480 or nothing. What do you want to do? Sign it. Went out and promoted the thing, whatever else, filled the place up. The third year, we, instead of putting 8 at the table, we put 10 at the table. The last year we were there, we had 660 people having breakfast. The governor came, politicians came, the state senators came, the United States senators came. I will tell you one thing. He told me, he said, I will never raise your rate. He said, the kind of people you bring to Camelback, he said, I couldn't advertise and get those kind of people here. The interesting thing is, when the governor came, the FBI and the state police came a day before and went through everything, searched the kitchen, searched everything. We talked about that this weekend. How could the governor of Pennsylvania come when 24 hours ahead of time, the Secret Service and the state police searched everything. Donald Trump comes, a national figure running for president, and they let a guy get on the roof, 200 yards away from him? Anyway, but that is now, I did that for 25 years and realized that I was not getting any younger. I wanted to see the thing continue, so I turned it over to a younger person. As the count, as of this morning, is 850. She says she's going to get the first year we went there was last year, and there were, I think, 700 there, and she said Darryl Strawberry is going to be the speaker this year. She signed a contract for the 1,000-seat dining room. We're up to 850, and she said by October 1st, that's going to be full. That has made national headlines too. Pocono Mountains of Pennsylvania hosts one of the largest prayer breakfasts in the country.
How about that? That is something to be proud of.
So there's a lot of negatives in the Poconos, but there's also a lot of positives.
Yeah.
We've made it a point to never have a minister or a priest as a speaker. We have a lay person, whether it's a sports figure, a business person, a political figure, to come and simply share. Tell you three things. Tell us three things. What your life was like before you found the Lord, how you found the Lord, and how your life changed. When you're done telling us that, sit down. And that's the way it's worked. Pat Williams, I told you, I had his autograph. He came one year and spoke. Cal Thomas came and spoke. Zig Ziglar spoke. It's one of the things for a small community. Philadelphia does one, but I don't think they get 1,000 people out. For a small community of Monroe County, you get people there, and we tell you, political people, we have county commissioners participating and so on, but the year you're running for office, you cannot participate in the program. We have people saluting the flag, doing the Pledge of Allegiance, praying the Lord's Prayer, whatever, but not the year you're running. We invite Democrats and Republicans. We ask them, if you're running for office, please don't wear a political badge. This is not political. For 2 hours, we're Americans. We're not Democrats or Republicans. And they respect that. So you're welcome to come the first Tuesday in October, 6 o'clock in the morning at Kalahari. And I recommend getting an early seat because it'll fill up.
Okay, great. This might be a good place to end this interview, Jack. Was there anything else that I should have asked you about that you wanted to talk about today before we end?
I think I said enough. I mean,
you said fascinating stuff, really.
It's a great community. I never got everything I wanted in life, but I never got what I deserved either. So it's been an interesting ride. It's been good to me. It's a great community to live in. People come looking around here, and I say, look, I'm going to be honest with you. There's problems, but it's still a great place to live. People still care about each other, and taxes are going up, crime is going up, but still, the real Monroe County people are good people. Do we have illegal aliens here? Yeah, we do. I can tell you where some of them are. I'm obviously not opposed to immigration. Both my parents were immigrants, but they came here, they learned the language, they never collected welfare, they never collected unemployment, and they instilled in us, you serve, you give back to the community. So the Pocono Mountains are a great place to live. Hopefully things will turn around. The United States of America has its problems, but there's no place else I want to live. So it's still the best place in the world. And I always say, for those who don't like it here, the door swings both ways, you know. And for those that come here from the city and complain about the Poconos, I tell them 80 still goes east. So, you know, you're welcome to, if you don't like it, you're welcome to go home.
Well, that's a great note to end on, Jack. I want to thank you very much. I really
Well, I want to thank you for letting me share that.